what I want to do with the second hour, it's not going to take an hour because we're going to also do the evaluations before we quit. But I usually try to do some closing remarks, and certainly am happy to answer any questions or open this up for discussion as much as possible. Basically, what I'm trying to do here is make sure you see how we've seen some certain themes that have gone throughout the whole semester. And these themes continue throughout the history of the church. And so I'm hoping that you will see these threads that go beyond this course into History 2 and even into your other classes as well. Before I get to that, though, I just want to point out, hopefully I don't have to convince you at this point that studying history is important. Maybe that's something I should have said at the beginning, but the very fact that we say a creed, and I know not all of us here say the creed as often as some of us, but the very fact that we have a creed like the Nicene Creed, and the fact that this creed mentions, for example, the historical character of Pontius Pilate, all of that, it reinforces the fact that this religion of ours, Christianity, is a historical religion. It is not a mythology in the sense of something that is stories that take place in the time before time at the top of Mount Olympus or something like that. This is about God intervening and interacting in human history. And of course, I think we might agree that as Christians, we believe that the main way, or the most important way, or the most direct way that God has intervened in human history is in the person of Jesus Christ. And that sort of becomes central for our religion. But we also believe that God continues to act within history. And this is not unique to Christianity. Judaism is the same way. When Jews celebrate the Passover, they're remembering the ways in which God was active in their own history, in the Exodus, etc. So it matters that our religion is a historical religion. It matters that things happened in history. And, we do acknowledge that the recording of history can be problematic, and the recording of history can be biased, or can, and always does, include interpretation. And those are issues we deal with. But at the same time, it matters that it's historical. It's important that it's historical. And, again, just as Judaism, on which our faith is based, the fact that God has intervened in history in the past ought to give us hope for the future, and ought to give us a sense of God's presence at the present time as well. So studying the history of the church, I hope you've gotten the sense now that it isn't simply an academic exercise, but it's relevant, and it's important not just for the present but for the future as well. Now, having said that, there are these themes which run through the history of the church that will continue. And when we were doing our A-team class, one of the students came up with didn't you come up with the circle of ologies? Wasn't that you? Yes, that was Julie. So the circle of ologies. And because I was making the point that concepts such as anthropology, Christology, soteriology, eschatology, ecclesiology. These concepts are all interrelated. And sometimes I call this the divine sweater, because everything's interwoven, and you start pulling on one thread and the whole thing unravels. And put that in a different way, Remember, as I said, my observation or law number 3, Christology informs soteriology. So that whatever you decide to believe about Christ helps determine what you believe about salvation, or vice versa. It might work the other way. If you start with some assumptions about soteriology, that will drive your beliefs about Christology. And you see that going all the way back to the beginning of the church, but you see it especially in Anselm, whom we talked about tonight, when he talks about the God-man, and the reason why Christ has to have 2 natures has to do with salvation. But also, it's connected to anthropology, because when we talked about atonement, we talked about how your assumptions about anthropology, whether you have a more optimistic or a more pessimistic anthropology, as I like to say it, will also determine to what extent soteriology is all about what God does, or is it all about what we do, or is it some combination of the two? And so, with the Pelagian controversy, for sure, we saw the connection between anthropology and soteriology, right? Now, with the Donatist controversy, we saw the connection with ecclesiology, because then the connection of anthropology and ecclesiology was, again, if you have a certain anthropology, maybe a more optimistic anthropology, if you assume that humans can be perfect, then you expect them to. And then you might have a more Donatist ecclesiology that says, well, if you're not perfect, you don't belong with us. Now, the Donatist controversy also shows us that there's a connection between ecclesiology and sacramental theology. Because if you have a more Donatist ecclesiology that assumes that the church should be this sort of enclave of the perfected, right? Well, that also is interrelated to how you see the sacraments. The sacraments being something that the presider has to be perfect or whatever in order for the sacrament to be valid. Whereas in the more Roman view of the sacraments, if you recognize that people are imperfect, and then you don't require a perfect presider in order for the sacraments to be valid. So you get the connection there too. So all of these things are interrelated, and I think you will see these themes track on into your History 2 class. When you take History 2, clearly when you start looking at the debate over with Calvin over election, you're going to see these themes of the Pelagian controversy come back. You're going to see these themes of ecclesiology come back. I mean, in some ways what Calvin was trying to do in Geneva is not necessarily all that different from maybe what the Donatists were trying to do, or even what Charlemagne was trying to do. And so, you see these themes coming back. If you have a very low anthropology, a very pessimistic anthropology, people can't be trusted, then it's okay to convert them at the point of the sword, right? As Charlemagne tried to do, because, they don't know what they're doing anyway, so let's force them to be Christian, we're doing them a favor. Well, that's one way of looking at anthropology that leads you to a certain sacramental theology that, you may not agree with, but you see the connection. So these themes will continue on, and will continue to be interrelated. Another theme that I hope you'll watch as you go through your other classes is this paradox of unity and authority. And because, we saw all the way going back to Ignatius of Antioch, who called himself a man set on unity, right? In order for there to be unity, there must be a centralized authority. Now, in the West, that evolves into the papacy, right? But even before, or as that's happening, in the East, authority cannot force unity. In other words, by the time you get to the Council of Chalcedon, the church splits in permanent ways. And you have the split of the Coptic Church and the Assyrian Church, so that as much as the church councils try to enforce theological unity, to keep the church one, it didn't work. And so you've got this paradox. It's almost like, what is that? Like mercury. Try and pick up a piece of mercury. You can't, because it's just too squishy. And that's this unity and authority thing. It's they're interrelated, but they're almost like two magnets that are when you have two magnets that are polarized the same way, you can't make them touch. But if they flip around the other way, I know it's a bad analogy, but you get the idea that there's this weird interrelationship between unity and authority. So that on one level, centralized authority maintains unity. I mean, let's face it, the United Methodist Church is an Episcopal church. It has bishops. Why? Well, because it's also a connectional church. And without the episcopacy, you don't have the connectionalism, right? Now, there's an upside and downside to all of this. You have other churches that operate on a congregational polity that have a more flat hierarchy, but don't have the connectionalism. So where's the balance? And there's benefits to the connectionalism and to the unity as well. So watch that theme as well as that develops throughout history and through your other courses. Hierarchy isn't always a bad thing, but power corrupts. So there are dangers inherent in it as well. So I think that maybe that's as much as I need to say by way of wrapping things up. But I'd like to open it up for any closing questions at this point, and see if there's anything you want to talk about with regard to these themes or the class as a whole. Anything specific in the class, or if you're thinking ahead to your final paper. You don't know what that is yet, do you?
No.
Not until 9:30 tonight.
Okay, so don't ask questions about that. Anything else, though? I'll just open it up. Yes?
I have a question about current events. Yesterday was the beatification of Jean Paul.
Mm-hmm.
There's another step towards sainthood. I guess I don't totally understand that process.
I don't either. I don't claim to be an expert on that. I know that in order, for beatification, that there is sort of the expectation that a miracle has occurred based on the saint-to-be's intercession. I don't know how they demonstrate that or how they prove that. So it's not really something I've ever looked into. I'm interested in it, but I've just never looked it up. So I'm not sure what the process is. But it is the first step on the way to sainthood. And remember we talked about this concept of saints. Obviously, as you know, in the New Testament, when Paul says, I'm writing to the saints, he's using that word to mean all Christians, holy ones. Saints are holy ones. They're not holy because they're perfect. They're holy because they're made holy. God calls us holy. But then over time, the tradition develops of saying, we get that, but who are the people that we know for sure are in heaven? The ones who are saints for sure, and maybe, and so then, we have this tradition of designating certain people as exemplars in the world, people whose examples we should follow. And as far as I'm concerned, we need more of those. So, but I don't really know the whole process. Julie?
They need to confirm one more miracle now that's occurred after his beatification.
Okay, so the second miracle has to occur after the beatification. Okay, and
unless it's waived by the Pope. The Pope can actually waive having a second miracle
interesting.
To move them on to canonization.
He's already waived some things in order to get this far, hasn't he?
Well, yes and no.
It's supposed to be a longer process, I thought.
Well, I don't know if there are any rules about that. I did hear someone on the news say that it's been 1,000 years since a pope beatified his immediate predecessor, right? But remember that that's just talking about when a pope is beatified. There have been times when other people who weren't popes were beatified this quickly. Not a lot. Usually it takes more time.
Usually it's not supposed to start until 5 years after their death. That's the only stipulation. But
And has
both-
it been 5 years?
No.
Yeah, it was 2005.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, but they started the process before that to get to this stage. I mean, the process itself isn't supposed to technically start until 5 years after their death. But you look at people like Francis and Clare, and both of them were their full canonization was complete in 2 years.
Right. Yeah. So again, but you know, Francis wasn't a pope, so
Right.
but after Francis died, someone who knew him personally became pope and got that, you know, process on the fast track. So yeah, it is fascinating. It's fascinating given all of the things that have been happening in the world. That's in the middle of it. But as I say, I think we need more saints in the world. So yeah.
What about St. John of the Cross? Where does he kind of fit in all?
He's a medieval mystic. I'm getting a buzz in my ear. He's a medieval mystic from Spain, right? Help me out here, Julie's our.
Oh man, you just keep putting me on the spot.
That's all right.
St. John of the Cross. Yeah, keep talking about him. Let me
Yeah.
double check.
He is famous for writing a piece called The Dark Night of the Soul, which is again a mystical piece. And you know, there are mystics throughout the history of the church. They seem to emerge more in the Middle Ages, and their writings tend to be, you know, highly symbolic. So, like if you read some of these writings, you know, there are other famous mystics, for example, like Hildegard of Bingen, or you know, or others. But if you read their writings, it can feel a lot like reading the Book of Revelation. Like, you know, wow, this is deep. I wonder what it means. You know. But remind me, did you get his dates there?
Yeah, 1542 to 1591.
Okay, 16th century.
Right, Counter-Reformation, Spanish,
Right.
and he's one of two that received the title mystical doctor of the church.
Okay, and so I said medieval, but really that's Renaissance. Because he's really a little bit later, yeah.
Right.
At some point, I'm going to teach a course on the Middle Ages. I don't know how far, I'll go, but we'll, that would be the place to, talk about mysticism and stuff, because we'd have a little more time to deal with it. Anything else? Okay, well, you can stop the tape. That's